Obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome. Both obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette syndrome fall under the emotional and behavioral disorder category of IDEA. According to Smith, the federal definition of an emotional disturbance includes an inability to learn that cannot be explained by intellectual, sensory, or health factors, an inability to build or maintain satisfactory interpersonal relationships with peers and teachers, inappropriate types of behaviors or feelings under normal circumstances, a general pervasive mood of unhappiness or depression, a tendency to develop physical symptoms related to fears associated with personal or school problems. The state of New Jersey uses the same definition as the federal definition for an emotional disturbance. Obsessive-compulsive disorder falls into this category because students who have OCD do not always act and feel the way their peers do, and typically their thoughts and feelings lead them to act in abnormal ways. And because Tourette syndrome causes some students to say things or make noises that aren't normal and may seem unwarranted, and it also causes them to tick and twitch sometimes, that also falls in the same category. Students who have OCD experience unwanted thoughts or obsessions, which lead to repetitive behaviors, also known as compulsions. Students who suffer from this need to come up with coping mechanisms to calm and quiet their minds in order to focus on everyday activities. In some cases, students are slowed down because they feel the need to make sure everything they hand in to the teacher is perfect, or they struggle to read quickly because they organize number patterns in their head. For example, some students may think they have to read a sentence 3 times before they can move on to the next sentence. And students with Tourette syndrome, like I said before, they have physical tics which cause them to flinch frequently, and occasionally they'll make noises that do not seem fitting or appropriate for any given situation. For physical developmental characteristics, Tourette syndrome causes tics, like I had mentioned, which can be seen from a physical standpoint because they're twitches or things like that. Sometimes it's on their face, sometimes they twitch their whole head. It really depends on the person. It doesn't stunt their physical development, but it does cause them maybe to receive some looks from their peers. As for OCD, it also does not stunt physical growth or development, but sometimes it causes people to alter their physical appearance. In that one woman accounted that she started to wear a hat every single day because she thought that if she took her hat off, something bad would happen, whether it was to her or somebody else she didn't know. Panic attacks can happen to people with OCD if they can't find a way to cope with the thought they're having. And because panic attacks are so physically draining and they cause shaking and just fear in general, they become very exhausting. So a lot of people who have OCD are tired a lot of the time just because they're always trying to fight their thoughts, and when they're not fighting them, that usually means that either everything is okay or it means that they're in a complete panic, which is also exhausting. So it's very important for people to understand that people who have Tourette syndrome and OCD are on high alert pretty much 24/7, and they get very tired easily because of that. For emotional development, sufferers of both disorders have fear for multiple reasons. They may become crippled with worry for thinking that negative things that happen in the world around them are their fault if they do not follow certain rituals. So just for another example, one woman accounted that she was terrified that if she was not chewing the same piece of gum she had in her mouth for a whole week prior to getting on the airplane that she was taking to go to Hawaii, the airplane was going to crash. So she chewed that piece of gum for days and days, and even on the airplane, because she thought that if she didn't have that piece of gum in her mouth when she was on the airplane was going to crash and everybody on it was going to die and it was going to be her fault. So for some, they fear that every negative thing they see is in on TV or just in public on the news. They fear that everything they see will happen to them. So if someone with OCD sees a newscast and someone murdered somebody else, they may become afraid that either they are going to become a murderer and harm other people, or they may be afraid that somebody is going to break into their home and harm them. And they can't get the idea out of their head. It's not like a fleeting thought for them. It's like they spend hours worrying about it and thinking about it. For people with Tourette syndrome, they fear that they cannot control their own physical behaviors. And they also don't like that they can't explain why, because people ask them a lot why they're twitching or why they're making noises, and it's not something that they can easily explain. Being afraid can lead to sadness and frustration with oneself, because generally people with OCD know when they are acting or thinking in a way that is not rational, but they are unable to convince themselves of that. So they know it, but they can't stop it, and that is also scary for them. For the social aspect, a lot of people who have OCD enjoy their alone time because they spend so much of the time that they have with other people trying to hide their obsessions, trying to hide their compulsions. And this goes for people with Tourette syndrome too. They try their best and they give all their energy into trying to control the tics that they're having, that it becomes very exhausting for them to be around people, like I had mentioned before. So what they do is they enjoy their alone time, and that can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, because it's very important, especially at a young age, for students to be around their peers, be around people their own age, be talking in the same way that their friends are. And for a lot of them, they don't like having to explain why they're acting the way they're acting or why they're twitching the way they're twitching. And especially at a young age, kids are going to ask each other, like, why are you doing that? And especially when they can't explain it, it just gets very frustrating for the student who has OCD or who has Tourette syndrome. So they face a lot of loneliness, and they also, in some cases, are made fun of, which is not pleasant for anyone. And in other cases, they may just feel like their friends feel like they're a burden. They may feel like their friends just feel bad for them, which isn't good for their self-esteem, especially when they're developing at such a young age. They need to understand that they have a solid foundational support group of friends. And if they feel like their friends are judging them or just feeling bad for them, they're not going to have that secure friendship that every student needs. So it does get very hard for students with OCD and Tourette's from the social standpoint. For the cognitive characteristics, because OCD is caused by the mind, most of the symptoms of it relate to cognitive development. OCD is an inability to move past a thought or idea without analyzing it for a long period of time. And for people with OCD, their mind always has to be focused on something, and it always has to be active. So if there's no problem for them to be solving, they create problems, and that's where the obsessions and the compulsions come through. They want to be productive at all times, and students with OCD and Tourette's develop at the same time and at the same pace as their peers. They may even develop a little bit faster, because in a lot of cases, they're very, very smart, and that's half their problem in some cases, because they aren't challenged enough at school with the math problems that they're learning or the essays that they have to write. So what they do is they get their work done, and then they cause these other things for their minds to use to stay active, which aren't necessarily positive things. They constantly pull themselves away from thinking about the simple things that their peers are able to acknowledge and move on from. And instead, they dwell on small things, and their minds convince them something negative will come from not performing a ritual or one of their compulsions. So this can be very stressful for young students and even older students, because they have to balance not only their regular schoolwork, but also their mind is never quieted unless they're asleep. And that's just it's very stressful, and it kind of goes in a cycle, all these developmental characteristics, because all of the other elements lead to just the exhaustion that they experience because they're overworking their minds so much. For the levels of function, students with OCD and Tourette syndrome are generally very high functioning students. They won't be negatively affected in a school setting usually. They don't usually need an aide around them. A lot of times they don't have an IEP or a 504. In some cases they will have a 504 because they are experiencing different things than their peers, but some of them never even reach out to the school to let the school know because they know how to cope with it and they know how to deal with it on their own, and they don't need extra help. But in some cases they do, especially the more severe cases. They'll generally participate in class and they'll usually produce very good grades. One of the things that teachers have to keep in mind, though, is that for some students with OCD, because they spend so much time perfecting their assignments and perfecting the way they organize everything and making sure their handwriting is perfect, because that's another symptom. They want to make sure that everything is as perfect as possible when they hand it in. That can cause them to be a little bit slower in handing in their assignments, and in some cases it causes them to read slower because, like I mentioned before, sometimes they believe that they have to reread a sentence a certain amount of times before they can move on to the next one. And that can cause them to be slowed down from their classmates a little bit. But it's not the fact that they can't move on or that they don't understand. It's the fact that they have rituals that they need to follow, and that may cause them to be a little bit slower. For strengths and challenges, students with OCD, like I mentioned before, they're highly intelligent. And usually the students with Tourette syndrome are too. They're also very self-aware, which is a very positive thing in a lot of ways. Because OCD is a result of having an overactive mind, students with OCD typically excel in school, and they go on to study at esteemed colleges for their higher education. In some cases, students have a hard time doing things like homework because they become distracted by organizing what they need to do on paper and in their heads. But if the proper accommodations are made for them, they can produce high-quality work. Both Tourette's and OCD cause students to recognize and understand the types of situations that set them off or cause them to worry or tic more than usual. In knowing these things, students become good at avoiding such occurrences, because you have to keep in mind that they don't like the fact that they panic. They don't like the fact that they tic a lot, and I think it's a big misconception and misunderstanding that people have of students who have OCD and Tourette syndrome, that they like the attention or they're just doing these things for attention, and that is absolutely false. They hate the fact that they can't focus, and they hate the fact that they have to take time out of their learning to panic or to do these rituals, and that's something that they wish they could stop. So they generally try to avoid things that they know will cause them to panic. But as they get exposed to more and more new things, which happens in school for everyone, they'll learn new things that set them off. And if it's the first time that something is setting them off, they're not going to know to avoid it. So it's very hard for them to balance between avoiding things and letting themselves hear things without knowing necessarily what will set them off when they're learning something new. But once they know something does set them off, they try to avoid it. So for example, if a student knows that violence causes them to believe that they will become violent and harm others, or if they know that someone is going to, or if they know that they're going to believe someone is going to break into their home and harm them, they'll avoid watching crime TV shows with lots of violence in them, or they'll avoid watching TV shows that show the way that criminals think, because they don't want to develop those thoughts. They don't want to obsess about those thoughts, because then they're going to scare themselves and then they're going to go into a panic. And they also try to avoid reading books that disclose such information. And books can sometimes be worse than TV shows because the books give you the behind the scenes stuff that you can't see on TV, and they give you the mind process that the characters go through, and if they can read that and kind of see it from a first-hand perspective, they're not going to like that, and it's going to scare them. As for challenges with students who have OCD, they spend a lot of their time distracted by their own thoughts and concerns, as mentioned. In some cases, they may need to leave the classroom because they are in the midst of a panic attack, and that can be distracting to their peers, and it can detract from their own education. In some cases, students may need to seek extra help by going to counseling or taking medication. And once they start taking medication, it's hard to stop because it causes students to not use as many coping mechanisms as they had been on their own, which causes them to forget some of the things that work for them and some of the things that do not. OCD and Tourette's are also difficult to explain to others because the students are so aware of what causes the problem. Some peers and adults find it hard to believe that they cannot control their bouts of twitches or worries. This can lead to frustration, especially when it is family members who question the significance of the disorder the most. Feeling the need to perfect everything they do may also slow them down in school. So these are just some challenges that students with OCD and Tourette syndrome face, but they're challenges that usually can be overcome. Again, OCD is one of those things. Some of their peers may not even know that they have it if they can cope with it really well, or if the medication that they're taking is strong enough that it's helping them, and it's very hard to tell when they're worried. Some of them become very good at acting like everything is okay, even though internally they are struggling a little bit. Usually the counseling they seek is outside of school, so that doesn't usually affect them socially. I know students can be kind of harsh to their peers if they find out that they're going to counseling, because some students just don't understand why it's necessary. So that can be something that, patients or students who have OCD can kind of keep to themselves, and it's just something that they go through, and it's like taking a step back and just talking about how they feel with somebody who understands and who can help them find coping mechanisms or can prescribe them medicine that will make them feel better. So all of their challenges generally can be kind of made to be more mild or toned down, and in some cases they can even be solved. So when students are in school and they're having a hard time, there are some things that teachers can do to help their students who have OCD. And one of the things they can do is they can decrease the homework load for the students who have OCD. Because seeing a big pile of homework, yes, it's intimidating for any student, but it's especially intimidating for students who have OCD because they see a lot of homework and they just see a lot of time that they're going to need to spend. Because like I mentioned earlier, they are very concerned with perfecting the assignments that they hand in. They want every essay to be perfect. They want their handwriting to be perfect. They want to allot a certain amount of time for each thing that they do. And that can be exhausting on its own, just planning out how they're going to do it. So what some people recommend is that teachers just lessen the homework load, and in doing that, it will allow the students to do really well on all of the assignments they do. And they'll just do them a little bit at a time. They're more likely to get it done that way, and as a teacher, it's better to have them do small amounts over a longer period of time than it is to give them a lot to do all at once and have them hand nothing in. Because some students get intimidated by the amount of homework they have and the amount of time they know it's going to take them, and they just don't end up handing anything in. And you don't want that, especially not from your very intelligent students, which your students with OCD and Tourette syndrome, they are very intelligent and they know how to do the work, and you want to be able to give them positive feedback on their work. But if they're not handing anything in, you're not going to know how smart they are and how talented they are. So it's important that you accommodate for the time that they spend on their work. Another thing that can help students with OCD is arranging the seating. Now, each student is different, as we all know, but for OCD in particular, it's hard to tell which students require which types of atmospheres and where they learn best. So, some students will not be able to be sitting next to the door to the hallway, because sometimes the loudness in the hallway and the voices that they hear out there are going to cause them to not be able to focus very well, and you don't want that. So for students who need to focus, who get distracted easily because of their OCD, you're going to want them sitting closer to the front of the classroom, closer to your desk, or closer to where you lecture, and farther away from the door to the hallway, so that way they can focus better. But for some students, maybe a student with Tourette syndrome is going to be very self-conscious of the amount that they tick and the amount that the rituals they do. They're not going to want people to see them doing that, because that's going to distract them. Just the worrying about people seeing them is going to be distracting to them. So what you want to do for those students is you want to have them be closer to the back of the room, where they know that no one is looking at them. And you want them to be maybe even closer to the door, just so that, maybe the hearing other things will make them stop worrying about themselves so much, and the distraction will be kind of a positive thing. Because students who tick a lot and are very aware of that, they're most likely going to get their work done. They just need to be in a comfortable state, and to be fighting off what's naturally occurring to them, like the ticking or the rituals. It will just be, that is what's going to be more distracting to them than hearing something outside of their own mind. So it would be best for them to be closer to the door and closer to the back of the room, where they know no one is looking at them. Another thing that kind of correlates with the decreasing the homework load is just allowing more time for the students to take tests. And for the same reason as you would decrease the homework load for these students. They have a lot of pride in their work. They want it to be perfect. They need to hand it into the teacher knowing that it is the best thing they could have come up with. And that causes them to be slowed down a little bit. And in some cases, with the rituals, maybe they believe that they're not going to get the problem right unless they read the question 3 times. And that's going to definitely make them take a test at a slower pace than their classmates who only need to read the question once. So they should be allowed more time for tests, just so that they can make sure that they're doing it at a comfortable pace and that they're confident with the work that they're handing in. For teachers, there are a lot of different resources they can use to better educate themselves about OCD and Tourette syndrome, so that they can be the best teacher for their students as possible. So one resource that is great is school guidance counselors, or just school counselors in general. This is good for if teachers see that a student may be acting differently, but there's no diagnosed problem. What they could do is have a school counselor who has experience working with students of all kinds of backgrounds and all kinds of disorders come in and observe the student a little bit, and just see what kinds of activities, what kinds of rituals they're performing. And then maybe the school counselor can say, I think that this student may have OCD, and then they can move forward from that. Or if a student is already diagnosed, a school counselor can help the teacher understand how to work with a student who has OCD. Because it might be the first time that a teacher is being exposed to somebody with OCD, or at least the first time they're responsible for making sure that a person with OCD is successful from an academic standpoint. So school counselors can just give them all kinds of resources to help them better understand the disability, and help them and give them tools to help them reach the student in the best way possible. Another great resource is websites, particularly the Council for Exceptional Students, because this website has all kinds of information about each disability. So, for example, there's a whole description about OCD and about Tourette syndrome and what that means and what that looks like in a classroom, so the teachers know what to expect from the students. And it also shows some of the symptoms, just so that the teacher can kind of put themselves in their students' shoes and understand what they're going through better. Collaboration is a huge part of teaching in general, but especially for students who have OCD. If a teacher wants to reach a student, the best way to do that is to talk with teachers who have already had that student, because each student is different. You can research symptoms and you can research particular activities that students with OCD and Tourette's may perform, but you don't know what the individual student in your classroom is going to do until you've heard a first-hand experience with that student. So maybe it's normal for some people who have OCD to reread the question on a test a lot, but maybe your student doesn't have that symptom. Maybe instead they have to tap on a desk 3 times before they speak. That's something that you need to know, and that's something that a teacher who's had that student in a classroom before will be able to tell you. And then they can tell you about how they went about talking with the student, how they went about accommodating that student. So that is very helpful, and it's a way to keep it in the school too. Another great way to understand what your students may be going through is to read books and memoirs. So for example, the book Passing for Normal by Amy Walensky. This is a woman who has both Tourette syndrome and obsessive-compulsive disorder. So she knows what it's like and to have these things and to go through school. She went through elementary school and middle school and high school. She was never homeschooled, so she was in the same setting that you'll be teaching in. And she recounts her social and her cognitive and her physical and all of her developmental characteristics and her mindset and the frustrations she went through and also the positive things she went through and the improvements. And by celebrating her successes and feeling for her challenges, you'll have a better understanding of your students, and you'll have a better understanding of how to work with them and how to talk with them, because you'll find that you may think that if someone is uncontrollably ticking in your classroom or making noises, that student may not understand what you're saying to them. But after reading from somebody's perspective, they are understanding everything you're saying to them, and they're just like anyone else. They just have tics, they just have these things that they have to do, and they can't necessarily explain why. And in reading something like that, you'll be able to appreciate what they're going through, and you'll be able to appreciate how to reach them. The International Obsessive-Compulsive Disorder Foundation is also a great resource, because this resource provides videos of students who have OCD, and they also provide descriptions of what to expect for a family, which is something that's very helpful because, this disorder might be new. It's new to you, but it's also probably new to their family, the student's family, and you should understand where their family is coming from, because you're probably going to have to meet with their family a few times just to talk about their student, talk about their child, and in understanding what types of things the family has been reading and the research the family has been going through, you'll be able to be more empathetic toward the family, and you'll be able to be more personable to them too, and they'll have more confidence in you, knowing that you know kind of the same things that they know, maybe less, maybe more, but they'll feel more confident that their student is in good hands in your classroom if they know that you're understanding of their student's disorder and that you know about it. The cause of obsessive-compulsive disorder and Tourette's is mostly unknown, but there are 2 theories, and the first theory is that there are links between students who had strep throat at a very young age for both OCD and Tourette syndrome. And the reason for this is that the antibodies that the body forms when it fights the strep throat virus, they can build up, and what they do is they attack part of the brain called the putamen, and what that does is that controls a lot of the muscle control, it controls a lot of the memory, and so if there's damage done to that part of the brain, it may cause the tics of Tourette syndrome. And there's also evidence that the strep throat virus itself attacks the part of the brain that causes the students to struggle with moving on from certain things, which may lead to the obsessions that they have. So if a student had strep throat a lot growing up, that could be one of the reasons that they then develop OCD or Tourette syndrome, because there is damage done to the brain because of that. And the other theory is an excess of serotonin, which serotonin is one of the neurotransmitters that helps students with activity in their brain. And what happens is students with OCD usually produce so much serotonin so quickly that the neurotransmitter called HSERT that's supposed to kind of mop up the excess can't mop it up in time, so they just have this excess of serotonin in their brain, and that's what causes the hyperactivity and the need for something to be going on, the need for them to be thinking or obsessing or worrying about something always, because they have so much activity in their brain that just one thing at a time isn't enough for them to focus on. They have to be focused, they have to be active in order to keep that serotonin moving in their brain. Those are just theories, but they seem sound, and a lot of people have spent a lot of time researching those topics. So what to take away from all of this, and particularly what I took away from reading Amy Lindsay's story, is that OCD and Tourette syndrome cannot be completely controlled, which is something that a lot of people don't understand because it seems silly to them. What do you mean you're worried about something and you can't stop worrying about it? Just think about something else. But people with OCD and Tourette syndrome, they can't do that. They have these rituals that they have to perform, and they want to be able to stop. But in a lot of ways, even their coping mechanisms, that isn't enough for them to completely control what they're going through. So it's important to be empathetic about that and to be understanding about that, because even though I can tell myself to stop worrying about something, not everyone can. And it may be easy for me to move on, but that doesn't mean that it's easy for everyone else to move on from something. And it's an imbalance in their brain that's causing that. It's not a personality trait. It's the fact that their brain needs to be focused on something, and they can't stop worrying about it until their brain finds something else to focus on. Another thing is that it's extremely frustrating for the students who have OCD and Tourette's to not be able to stop. Amy recounts so many times that her dad was asking her, "Why are you doing this?" And he was getting so angry with her, and she couldn't explain why. And the lack of support that she had from him was even more frustrating. So a lot of things pile on to people who have OCD and Tourette syndrome all at once, and it causes them to really struggle with accepting themselves, which is a problem because every student is told and encouraged to accept who they are. But then in some cases, like with people who have OCD, people want them to change and they want them to not be who they are. But this is how they are naturally. And they try their best to hide it because it's embarrassing to them, and they don't like people asking questions about it, and they don't like the fact that sometimes they panic for seemingly no reason. They don't like that. So they are working hard to make sure that they're not acting in an abnormal way, but it's challenging for them, and it's not something that they can fix overnight or in a second. And it's very frustrating for that reason because their peers can, and that's hard for them to understand. One of the big misconceptions about Tourette syndrome that Amy covers in her book is that people think Tourette's is just kind of a constant Freudian slip. It's just blurting out whatever is on your mind. And that's actually not what Tourette syndrome is. That is one symptom of Tourette syndrome, but it's actually a very rare symptom for people to have. She went through multiple support groups for people with Tourette syndrome, and she only encountered one person in all of her support groups she went through that had that as one of the symptoms. So again, just to reiterate, Tourette's is more of twitches of the face and of the neck and the head. It's more of making noises, like maybe you have to hum loudly every 10 minutes or something like that. It's not just saying whatever's on your mind. And just to clear up another misconception, obsessive compulsive disorder is not just washing your hands repeatedly or making sure that everything is organized. Yes, a lot of students who have OCD are concerned with contamination and germs, and a lot of them like things to be in order, but that's not all obsessive compulsive disorder is. And it's actually very frustrating for people who have a diagnosed case of OCD when people organize a lot of things or color code their M&Ms and then they joke and say, I have OCD. That is extremely frustrating for people who actually have OCD because that's not what OCD is at all. And if they only knew. But OCD again it's having a thought and not being able to get it out of your head and maybe causing yourself to do rituals to make it better. A lot of times it ties in with religious views, so people may think that they have to pray every 3 minutes or else what they want won't happen. Or they have to pray for someone to not get into a car accident because they're in a car, and if they're not praying the whole time that person is in the car, they're going to get into a car accident. And even if there's evidence that that isn't true, they can't convince themselves of that. They have to continue to do these rituals just to make themselves feel better. And anxiety is a huge part of OCD, and that's why there are panic attacks tied to it, because people, they're just on high alert, they're on high anxiety, they're very worried, they're very fearful, and they're very worried all the time. So that's a lot different than making sure that all your red M&Ms and all your orange M&Ms are together. So, patience and understanding are keys to reaching students who have OCD. They really need your support. They need to know that you're not judging them as their teacher. You are there for them. You are willing to accommodate for them because what they have, it's a real disability and it's a real struggle that they go through every day. And they need to know that they are supported by someone who may not fully understand what they're going through, but is certainly willing to try to understand and is certainly empathetic toward the problems that they may be having, whether it's socially, physically, emotionally, mentally, anything. They need to know that you're there for them, and they need to know that you're not going to judge them, and you're not going to get frustrated with them for doing rituals, or for ticking, or for having an anxiety attack. They need to know that you are going to support them in everything that they try to do, and that you are willing to wait out their rituals, and that you see them for the person that they are, and not the disability that they have. You also have to understand that families may not take the diagnosis well. I know Amy talked about how her father, who also she found out later has OCD as well, but her father, a very old school kind of guy, he wasn't accepting of the fact that his daughter had something that made her different from others. He didn't like the fact that she ticked, and he always brought it up, and she describes her dinner table as a war zone because he would just constantly, why are you doing that? Stop it. And it was something that she couldn't stop, and that was frustrating for her to have to try to explain to him that she couldn't stop and that she wanted to. And eventually she just got to the point where she ignored it, and she had a great relationship with her father before the Tourette's and the OCD really set in. And she got to the point where she resented him a little bit, and she resented his remarks. So as the teacher, you need to understand that school may be the place that's more accepting to these students than their households, and that you need to make sure that it stays that way for them, because they may feel, like Amy did, like her own home is kind of a war zone, and they need to know that they have a place they can go and a person they can talk to about the problems they may be having at home, about people not understanding, and you need to be there for them, to be that person who understands, to be that person who's setting a positive environment for them so that they don't dread coming to school, and maybe even so that you can give them tools so that they don't dread going home either, even if their family isn't taking it well. And these are my references, and that's all. I hope you learned a little bit about OCD and Tourette syndrome, because I know I learned a ton. So, thank you.